Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. You know, where we cut through all the noise and get straight to the good stuff.
Fascinating stuff, right?
That's it, yeah.
Yeah.
Today we are diving deep into Canada's role in the Vietnam War.
Ooh, interesting.
And from what I've seen in this podcast episode from Mr. Hutchings History that you sent over,
Yeah.
it looks like Canada was playing both sides.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right.
A little bit.
Canada's role in the Vietnam War is a really fascinating kind of puzzle.
Okay.
It's full of diplomatic drama and covert operations, and this is interesting, an economic twist.
Okay, so it's way more complicated than just like support or opposition.
Way more.
So where do we even begin to untangle this web?
Well, I think a good place to start is 1963,
Okay,
with a big shift in Canadian leadership.
a shift in leadership.
John Deen Baker,
Okay.
he's out.
Right.
And Lester B Pearson steps in.
Okay.
And he brings a whole new approach to the Cold War with him.
So what was the big difference between these two guys?
Well, Deen Baker, he was very suspicious of American influence.
Okay.
He really was, especially when it came to nuclear weapons on Canadian soil.
Oh.
He pushed back against that pressure, which, unsurprisingly, caused some friction with the U.S.
Yeah. Okay.
But then Pearson comes along, and he makes this controversial decision to allow those American nuclear warheads in.
So they're trying to, it's like a balancing act.
Yeah.
They need to keep the U.S. happy, but they're also trying to assert their own independence in a way.
Exactly.
That's
It's a real tightrope walk. Canada needed its alliance with the U.S. during these tense Cold War years, but allowing nukes?
Yeah.
I mean, that must have caused quite a stir.
Yeah, I bet. But then Pearson does something even bolder.
Yeah.
It's 1965.
Uh-huh.
He's at Temple University. He's giving a speech.
Oh, yeah.
And he straight up criticizes the U.S. approach to the Vietnam War.
Yeah, the Temple University speech, it's a real turning point. He didn't just, disagree with the U.S. on, minor points.
Right. He questioned the effectiveness of their entire bombing campaign, and he even went as far as to suggest a pause to allow for diplomacy. You have to picture President Johnson deeply committed to this war effort.
Okay, yeah.
And then Pearson essentially saying, hey, maybe this isn't the best way to go about this.
So he's publicly calling out his biggest ally on the world stage.
Totally.
So I can only imagine that, went down well.
You can imagine, yeah.
So no wonder this podcast mentioned this, heated confrontation between Pearson and Johnson at Camp David.
Oh, yeah.
What was the fallout from that? Did this criticism, did it create a lasting rift between Canada and the U.S.?
Absolutely. This is a major strain on the relationship.
Okay.
Johnson felt very personally betrayed by Pearson's public dissent, especially after committing, so much American blood and treasure to South Vietnam.
Right.
It was a bold move.
It was a bold move.
A bold move by Pearson. Some saw it as, a courageous act of independence.
Well, others viewed it as, this major diplomatic blunder.
A blunder.
Yeah.
So we've got Pearson on one hand, right, pushing for peace talks, urging restraint.
Right.
But then on the other hand, this podcast is hinting that Canada was secretly supporting the U.S. war effort behind the scenes.
Yeah.
What was going on there?
That's the real kind of contradiction at the heart of this whole story.
Okay.
While Pearson's out there advocating for peace, Canada's simultaneously engaging in some pretty shady dealings.
Shady dealings.
For instance,
Okay.
over 30,000 Canadians volunteered to fight in Vietnam
Why?
alongside American troops.
That's not a small number.
No, it's a substantial number.
So it completely undermines this image of Canada as this neutral peacemaker.
Totally.
Wow. 30,000. That's definitely not what you'd expect from a country that's saying they're advocating for peace.
Yeah.
And what about the economic involvement? The podcast mentioned something about Canadian companies profiting from the war.
Yeah, this is where it gets even more complicated. Over 500 Canadian companies supplied the U.S. military with an estimated $2.5 billion.
The billion, wow.
Worth of materials. And we're not just talking, boots and bandages here.
Wow.
We're talking Agent Orange,
Whoa.
napalm.
Okay.
Some of the most controversial and devastating weapons of the war.
Yeah.
It raises some serious moral questions about Canada's role in all of this.
Whoa. Agent Orange and napalm.
Hmm.
That's heavy stuff. And didn't the podcast say that these chemicals were even tested on Canadian soil?
That's right, yeah.
That's a pretty shocking revelation.
It is. It's a dark chapter.
What was the justification for that?
It's hard to say. The testing of these weapons on Canadian soil, it adds another layer of complexity, right?
Right.
It suggests that Canada wasn't just passively supplying these materials.
Right.
They were actively participating in the development and deployment of these very controversial weapons.
Mm-hmm.
The reasons behind it, it's hard to say for sure, right?
Yeah.
It could be a lot of things, from economic interests to Cold War anxieties, but it undeniably tarnishes Canada's image as this peaceful nation.
Okay, so we have Canada's public stance is all about peace and diplomacy,
Yeah.
but their actions are telling a very, very different story.
Yeah.
You know, they have troops on the ground, companies supplying weapons, and they're even involved in testing these horrific chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
How can we make sense of this? How can we make sense of this contradiction?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Historians have been wrestling with this for decades.
Yeah.
You know, was Pearson a genuine peace advocate who was kind of forced to compromise?
Right.
Or was he skillfully, playing both sides to advance Canada's interests?
Right.
I mean, it's a debate that continues to this day.
It sounds like there's no easy answer here.
No.
Just a whole lot of gray area.
Yeah.
So how do historians make sense of this? The podcast mentions different perspectives on Canada's role.
Right. There are several competing interpretations, each offering a unique lens through which to view this complex historical episode.
Mm.
So one perspective is that of liberal internationalism.
Liberal internationalism.
Historians who kind of subscribe to this view, they see Canada's actions, despite all the contradictions, as aligned with its commitment to international cooperation and diplomacy.
Okay.
They believe that Pearson's criticisms of the U.S. were totally sincere,
Okay.
and that he genuinely sought a peaceful resolution.
So the liberal internationalists are saying that Pearson was walking the walk.
Yeah.
Even if it was a bit of a wobbly one.
A little wobbly, yeah.
But they're saying he was still trying.
Yeah, they argue that, for Canada, supporting these international institutions and promoting diplomacy, that was crucial.
Right.
Even when it meant, making some compromises along the way.
Okay, that's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
But what about folks who see things a little more, cynically?
Yeah.
The podcast mentioned something about a realist interpretation. What's that all about?
Right. So realism, it takes a more pragmatic approach.
Okay.
Realists, they emphasize that Canada, a smaller country, right next to a superpower,
Right.
they had to tread carefully.
Yeah.
They argue that Pearson was like a pragmatist, right?
Okay.
Who understood that maintaining this strong relationship with the U.S., it was essential.
Even if it meant turning a blind eye to some of their actions in Vietnam.
Exactly.
So according to the realists, they're saying that Canada couldn't afford to, alienate the U.S., both economically and in terms of, security.
Yeah.
So quietly supporting the war effort was a way to keep those vital relationships intact.
Exactly.
That makes sense. But it still feels a little, morally ambiguous.
It does.
What about critical theory? The podcast mentioned a historian named Victor Levant who takes a more critical approach.
Yeah.
What's his take on all this?
Yeah, critical theorists like Victor Levant, they really dig into the power dynamics at play here.
Mm-hmm.
They argue that Canada's actions in Vietnam were primarily driven by economic self-interest.
Okay, so it's all about the bottom line.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Even while they're publicly advocating for peace, Canada's military-industrial complex is profiting handsomely from the war.
So they're talking the talk, but their actions are all about, the money.
Exactly.
Mm.
And critical theorists, they see this as a prime example of how economic interests can sometimes trump moral considerations.
Okay.
Especially, when powerful nations are involved.
Okay, so we've got all these different interpretations.
We do.
It's starting to feel like, this is a very layered story.
It is.
Is there any way to sum up all these different perspectives?
It's tough to reconcile these contrasting viewpoints.
Yeah.
But one thing is clear.
Okay.
Canada's involvement in the Vietnam War, deeply paradoxical.
Okay. Yeah.
It's this tangled web of diplomacy and covert operations and economic opportunism.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's kind of up to each individual to weigh the evidence and decide how they want to interpret this complex chapter in history.
All right, so we've covered the diplomatic maneuvering, the behind-the-scenes support. But what about the impact on Canada itself?
Right.
Did the war have any, lasting effects on Canadian society?
It had a profound impact.
Okay.
both economically and socially.
Okay.
Let's start with the economic side.
Okay, yeah.
Remember all those Canadian companies?
Yeah.
Supplying materials to the U.S. military?
Over 500.
Right, yeah. And that $2.5 billion in trade?
Right.
That had a significant impact on the Canadian economy.
Okay.
Boosted industries, created jobs, contributed to a period of economic growth.
Yeah, that's a pretty big economic boost. But wasn't there also like a moral cost associated with,
Yeah.
profiting from a war that many Canadians opposed?
Absolutely. I mean, the economic benefits were undeniable, but they definitely came at a price.
Okay.
Many Canadians felt deeply conflicted, about profiting from a war that they saw as unjust, immoral.
Right.
And this moral dilemma really fueled the anti-war movement in Canada,
Okay.
which saw a ton of growth during the late 1960s.
So the war wasn't just like some abstract, foreign policy debate.
No.
It was actually causing real divisions within Canadian society.
Absolutely. The Vietnam War, it brought the debate about war, peace, Canada's role in the world right into Canadian living rooms.
Wow.
It sparked heated discussions, fueled protests.
Wow.
It forced Canadians to confront some uncomfortable truths about their country's actions.
Wow. It's incredible how one conflict can have such a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Impacting everything from a country's economy to its social fabric.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, did this experience change Canada's approach to foreign policy in the years that followed?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's one that historians continue to debate.
Okay.
Some argue that the Vietnam War made Canada much more cautious about military interventions, especially those led by the U.S.
It makes sense. I mean, after witnessing the devastating consequences of Vietnam, both, for the Vietnamese people and for the countries involved, you would think there would be some hesitation to jump into another conflict like that.
Yeah, for sure.
Did Canada ever fully reconcile its role in the war?
Reconciliation's a complex process.
Yeah.
And it's one that continues to this day, The legacy of Canada's involvement, it's multifaceted, it's nuanced.
Okay.
There's a sense of pride, right?
Right.
In Canada's long-standing tradition of peacekeeping, humanitarian aid.
Okay.
But there's also this lingering discomfort
Okay.
with the country's complicity in the Vietnam conflict.
So it's not a chapter that Canada can just close the book on and forget.
No, not really.
Are there still debates and discussions about it today?
Absolutely. The Vietnam War, it continues to be a topic of discussion and debate in Canada,
Yeah.
It's taught in schools, it's discussed in the media, it's explored in academic research.
Yeah.
I mean, Canadians, they're still grappling with the complexities of their country's role, and they're still trying to understand what lessons can be learned.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
One of the things that's really struck me about this whole story is the moral dilemma that Canada faced.
Yeah. Yeah.
On the one hand, they're publicly advocating for peace and diplomacy.
Right.
But on the other hand, they're secretly supporting the U.S. war effort.
Yeah.
And even profiting from it.
Uh-huh.
How do you reconcile those two things?
Well, it's a classic example of the challenges that nations face when they're trying to balance their ideals with their interests.
Right.
In the case of Canada, they were caught between their desire to be seen as this peaceful nation, right?
Yeah.
And their economic and security dependence on the United States.
Okay.
I mean, it's a difficult balancing act.
Yeah.
And there are no easy answers.
It seems like every decision had consequences. There was no way to please everyone. It makes you wonder if they could have handled things differently.
Hindsight's always 20/20.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that, these decisions are made in a particular context.
Right.
At the time, the Cold War was a very real threat.
Right.
And Canada felt a strong obligation to support their allies.
Right.
However,
Yeah.
the Vietnam War, it also demonstrated the dangers of blindly following a superpower into conflict.
Right.
And it forced Canada to kind of reevaluate its role in the world.
So speaking of reevaluating their role, did this experience change how Canada interacted with the U.S. moving forward?
Yeah.
Did they become more assertive, or did they kind of fall back into that same pattern of following the American lead?
That's a complex question.
Yeah.
Canada remains a close ally of the United States.
Okay.
But the Vietnam War undoubtedly had an impact on their relationship.
Okay.
Canada became more willing to chart its own course on certain issues, and it demonstrated a greater commitment to multilateralism and diplomacy.
So maybe a more balanced relationship.
Right.
Where they cooperate on some things, but they're not afraid to disagree on others.
Exactly. The Vietnam War marked a real turning point in Canada's foreign policy. It forced them to confront some tough questions about their identity, their values, and their place in the world.
Right.
And, while they may not have always gotten things right,
Right.
they emerged from this whole experience with a renewed sense of purpose.
Okay.
And a commitment to playing a more independent role on the global stage.
So while Canada's role in the Vietnam War may have been morally ambiguous, it ultimately led to a more mature and independent foreign policy.
Precisely. The Vietnam War, it was a crucible for Canada.
Okay.
This trial by fire. It tested their values. It forced them to define their role in this complex and rapidly changing world.
This whole deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexities of history.
Yeah.
It's not just about dates and battles.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the human stories.
The moral dilemmas.
The moral dilemma.
The lasting impact of these events.
The lasting impact.
Absolutely.
So,
the Vietnam War, it's a perfect example of how history continues to shape our world today. It's a reminder that we need to engage with the past, learn from its mistakes, and strive to build a more peaceful and just future.
well said. And speaking of engaging with the past, we only scratched the surface here.
Yeah, we have. Yeah.
There's so much more to explore, from the personal stories of Canadian soldiers, draft dodgers, to the cultural and political shifts that occurred during this whole era.
Absolutely. If this deep dive has piqued your interest, there's a wealth of resources available to kind of delve deeper into this fascinating chapter of history.
Yeah, absolutely. But before we wrap things up, I'm curious to hear your final thoughts. What's the most surprising or thought-provoking takeaway from all of this?
What's really stuck with me is the enduring legacy of this conflict on Canada's national psyche. It wasn't just a foreign policy decision,
Sure.
It sparked this national conversation about who they were as a nation.
So it challenged their self-image as peacekeepers.
Exactly, yeah. And it forced them to confront the realities of their close ties with a superpower that's engaged in this controversial war.
Right.
And the echoes of that struggle are still felt today, in Canada's approach to international relations.
Okay, so if we were to sum up Canada's role in the Vietnam War in, just a few words, what would they be? Peacekeepers turned profiteers.
Yeah.
Moral crusaders caught in this web of real politics.
It's tough, right? It's definitely complex.
Yeah.
But I think rather than trying to, label it neatly,
Yeah.
I think the real value is in understanding the nuances, the contradictions, the difficult choices that Canada had to face. It reminds us that history is rarely black and white. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's full of shades of gray.
And it's those shades of gray that make it so fascinating to explore.
Yeah.
It's not about passing judgment.
Right.
It's about trying to understand how a nation grappled with such a pivotal moment in history.
Exactly, yeah. And I think it's a testament to the enduring significance of the Vietnam War.
Okay.
That we're still discussing its impact on nations, like Canada decades later.
Wow, yeah. If our listener wants to learn more, where should they start?
Yeah.
Any books, documentaries you'd recommend?
Yeah, totally. If you're, interested in the Canadian perspective,
Yeah.
I highly recommend checking out Victor Levant's work. We mentioned him earlier.
Yeah, we did.
He offers this, critical perspective that
Yeah.
really challenges these conventional narratives.
Okay.
And for a broader understanding of, the Vietnam War itself, Ken Burns' documentary, it's fantastic.
I've heard that, yeah.
It's a very comprehensive and deeply moving account of the conflict.
Those are great recommendations. And before we wrap up, I have one final thought for our listener. As you delve deeper into this topic, I want you to consider this. How do you think Canada's experience in Vietnam might shape their response to future conflicts or crises? How does this inform the present and the future?
That's a great question to kind of leave people with.
Yeah, I think so. It really challenges us to, use the past to inform us.
Absolutely.
Well, deep divers, we've reached the end of our exploration into Canada's really complicated role in the Vietnam War. It's been a journey, hasn't it?
It has, yeah.
Full of, twists, turns, and some pretty uncomfortable truths. But as we've seen, history is rarely simple.
Right.
And that's what makes it so compelling. So until next time, keep diving deep and never stop questioning the narratives that we're given.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.